My name is Jawad Panah, and I'm a CSPC Program Committee member. We acknowledge that the Canadian Science Policy Conference is taking place in an unceded, unsurrendered territory of Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to operate in this land. We are about to participate in an interactive panel titled Canada's Advanced Technology Supply Chains Becoming More Fragile or More Resilient, organized by CMC Microsystems. Please do not forget to tweet about the favorite events and panels at the conference using @SciencePolicy and hashtag CSPC 2022. Finally, please don't forget to fill out the evaluation survey for this session in the program app. Your feedback is important to us and help us to make a better CSPC event next year. I hope you enjoyed this panel. Thank you, and I pass it to Madison to start the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone, bonjour. Donc le panel va se dérouler en anglais, mais s'il vous plaît, si vous avez des interventions, des questions, sentez-vous libre de le faire dans la langue de votre choix. So, hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Madison. I am the Executive Director of Optonic, which is Quebec's photonics industry cluster. Some of you may have seen me over the last few days. I am also a member of Dr. Mona Niemer's Youth Council, so I've been speaking in that capacity a few times. But today, we get to talk about supply chains. And I will start off by saying that I myself am not a supply chain expert. That's why I have these amazing experts beside me. But like many of you, I hear about the strain, about the consequences, about the worries of what's to come. And in my day job, I actually work with a lot of photonics companies who have been reporting on delayed shipments, on longer lead times, on basically increased costs of what that's been resulting in. And this is only one sector, right, within advanced technology supply chains. But one thing that is common among Canada's different supply chains is the fact that we live within a global reality. So that is something that we will be touching on today. So it's great to take the opportunity while we're at CSPC to dive into a discussion about the resilience, or the lack thereof of resilience, of Canada's advanced tech supply chain. So today we are welcoming experts from academia, from industry, from government, and also actors in between the triple helix to address the question of Canada's advanced tech supply chain. So before I introduce our experts, I want to ask you by show of hands, who is from industry? Nope, so not too many people from industry. How about from academia? All right, from government? Oh, that's what we were hoping. Yes. So I don't know if that might be, are they taking the filter off? And also, now I'm going to ask again. So by show of hands, who believes that Canada's advanced tech supply chains are becoming more resilient? Ooh, we're going to have to hear you turn. And who believes that they are becoming more fragile? A lot of people are undecided. That's what I understand. Okay, thank you. So now I want to briefly introduce each of our panelists up here. And after I introduce each of you, I'm going to ask you to answer basically the same question that our audience just answered about the resilience or the fragility, and share your initial thoughts on the issue before we dive deeper into the discussion. So first off, I have the pleasure of introducing Esther Jurasin, who is an economic analyst at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, where she is responsible for performing quantitative analysis and economic research on various policy issues. In addition to her work for the Ontario Economic Report, she chairs the Infrastructure Policy Council and supports the organization's advocacy work on infrastructure, transit and transportation, supply chains, and broadband connectivity. So Esther, I'll let you answer the question and give us your initial thoughts on the issue.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks again for having me. And thank you all for coming in. I know it's 3:30 and probably everyone's feeling tired. So really appreciate you all being here. A little bit about my background before I get into answering that question. So I work with the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, and as policy people, I do hope you know what that is. But if not, for over a century, we've been doing a lot of research and advocating on some of the most pressing policy issues on behalf of a very diverse network of business members. We have about 60,000 members in our organization all across industries and all across the various regions of Ontario. So as you can imagine, when the pandemic hit, we were hearing a lot about supply chains. And if you had asked me 2 years ago if I'd ever be speaking on supply chains, I never honestly would have thought I would be. I would hardly consider myself a supply chain expert, but here we are. And after relentless conversations and comments and feedback from our members across industries, it's safe to say that supply chains are a really big issue, and they continue to be a big issue. So to answer the question about whether I think that they're more resilient or more fragile, I'm sort of with the majority of you guys. I'm on the fence about that. I think that for the most part, because of the nature of supply chains and how interconnected they are, I think it's very hard to avoid them being fragile. Regardless, as long as you have various components, as long as you're dealing with a very global network, you're always going to be at risk of a ton of things that you can't control. So you're just at the mercy. But does that mean that we have no hope and we don't have the ability to become more resilient? No, I don't think so. And the fact that the pandemic happened and gave us this wake-up call is a really good start for that. A lot of businesses are desperately trying to figure out what it is they need to do to improve their supply chain resiliency. And I think that's very encouraging. I think that means that there's hope for supply chains, and as long as we have that kind of direction, I think that's a good place to be.
Thank you so much, Esther. Next up, I want to introduce Johnny Rungtusanatam, who is Canada Research Chair in Supply Chain Management at the Schulich School of Business at York University. He has held faculty, visiting faculty, and administrative positions at universities across the globe. Johnny is considered to be one of the top 50 authors of research in operations management, as well as in supply chain management. And obviously, I'm cutting his bio short. So Johnny, I want to ask you, resilient or fragile?
Well, first of all, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Madison, for having me. I'm not a policy person. I'm not even an engineering person, even though I have an IE background. I'm a business person, right? So I've spent 30 years looking at why supply chains don't work, right? And when they don't work, it means that you, as a consumer, won't get the product or service that you expect to get walking into a physical store or a virtual store or a digital store. Now, the question of whether supply chains are resilient or more resilient or fragile is probably a question that needs to be asked second to the first question, which is that, supply chains generally fragile? And the answer is yes. And the reason is because supply chains are like living organisms. They change over time, sometimes because somebody else made a decision. The government made a decision that stop certain goods or services from flowing into Canada, and therefore Canadians now see a shortage. And there are plenty of examples out there, right? So the supply chains being living organisms means that it's impossible to control every aspect of the supply chain. The best we can do is to figure out when things do not go right, how quickly can we react so that we can get back to normal. So my answer to the question is, let's start by acknowledging the fact that supply chains are inherently fragile.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Next up, we have Claude Goodman, who has over 30 years of professional experience in policy, business, and corporate development. He has successfully developed and implemented strategic plans in national organizations. And most recently, he has been working on quantum technologies, semiconductors, IoT, and smart city files. Claude.
I didn't know I did all that.
It's always nice to be reminded, isn't it?
I just made it all up. I spent half of my professional experience with the Conference Board of Canada, and the other half in government, working mostly in economic development and other part in policy, science policy. All right. I guess I was asked to join this group because in my more recent life over at ISED, I worked in the industry sector, and we were looking at more closely the semiconductor sectors and the quantum, and which is why I'm here today. Now, to answer the question, is the ICT? I'm just going to call it the ICT. Is the ICT sector more fragile or resilient? I'm going to have to agree with Johnny here. They're fragile. They've always been fragile. They've been fragile since the 70s, I guess. And when I get back in the 70s, companies used to be highly, vertically integrated, and you had n number of companies operating within that sphere. And with the advent in the 80s and 90s of pure play foundries and designing shops, we saw a distribution across the globe of specialty areas, EU, US, Canada, East Asia, so on and so forth. So by definition, the supply chains are fragile. They have been fragile. Are they more fragile now? Yes. They've been fragilized to a certain extent. And what we're seeing more recently, though, is, individual governments across the globe want to invest in securing their supply chains. China has announced theirs, the Chips for America Act. The EU announced their own strategies and policies and so on. And Canada, I'm glad to say that we are in the process of developing our own semiconductor strategy, which will be announced, I guess, imminently. But to answer the question, yes, it's fragile. It's always been fragile. It's fragilized even more so. It's looking better down the road. All right.
Merci beaucoup, Claude. And last but not least, I want to introduce Robert Crawhall, who is Fellow and Executive Director of the Canadian Academy of Engineering. So through his company, how do I pronounce it? Inazec, sorry. Thank you. Inazec Innovation. He consults on innovation management and innovation ecosystems and serves as a strategic advisor to the Global Advantage Consulting Group. Robert has over 40 years experience working in technology development and supply chains. Robert.
Thank you. So I think I'll pick up on a number of points that my co-panelists have talked about here. I come at this, I would say, from a slightly less forgiving perspective. So supply chains and management of supply chains is one of the critical dimensions of competition out in the marketplace. And in different, we've had a couple of years that were a pandemic, and we've had other years that have had other problems and oil crises and things. Like, there's always stuff that's trying to upset your supply chain. But what I would say is, if you take a company like Apple, Steve Jobs was a visionary. Tim Cook is a supply chain guy, right? Apple is what it is today because of the way it manages its supply chains. I was on the board of aerospace parts manufacturer, second tier, in Montreal, or Bois de Bouillon. And in Montreal, Air Montréal does a supply chain management, the MACH program, that has massively improved the transparency and efficiency of Canadian supply chains in the aerospace sector. So I would say and just a couple of other quick, so for a number of years, I was with Bell Northern Research. We were developing a lot of technologies. What I learned fairly quickly was, before you went to the universities, you went to the supply chain management group and talked to them about what you were trying to do. because otherwise you develop stuff and then found it wasn't going to fit. So I think the fact that this room is full of people from a policy and government perspective is excellent. I think the fact that you're interested in supply chains is excellent. I want you to think in terms of, from a Canadian economic perspective, what we're trying to do is to bite off the biggest possible chunk of global value chains. And one aspect of that value chain is the supply chain, which to me means widgets floating around, and there are financial flows, which we could do with a lot more of. There are people flows, there are information flows, but having highly competitive supply chains is one element of an effective Canadian economy. So.
Thank you so much, Robert. So whoever introduced, I'm looking for you. There you are. So in the introduction, he did mention that it is an interactive session. So I'm going to be asking our esteemed panelists a few questions. But if you want certain precisions, there are certain elements you want to dig deeper into, please stand up and come to the mic to ask your questions. So to kick things off, I want to go through each of our panelists and ask you, what do you see as the main risks and issues for supply chains moving forward? And I'm going to go the other way around, and I'll start with Robert.
Well, I think just to carry on from the point that I was making, I think the risks are Canadian companies not being sufficiently attuned to their supply chains. That they're if supply chains are weak, then you need to find a way to bolster them. If your products are susceptible to supply chain interruptions, maybe you should be thinking about a different way of designing them. So I think that the biggest risk is that, I did a bunch of work in Industry 4.0. So a big element of Industry 4.0 is transparency, visibility, pre-planning of your supply chains. So I think the biggest risk is not paying enough attention to it. The good news is that people are now paying attention to it.
Thank you so much, Robert. Claude, what would you say are the main risks and issues moving forward for the supply chain?
Geez, I don't know.
Speak about what you know, semiconductors.
No. Actually, I'm going to quote some people actually studied this. StatsCan released their, in their last quarter, some data on that. And apparently, the risk, 60% of the companies out there, this is an aggregate number, not necessarily limited to ICT sector. But 60% of the companies don't know if it's going to last. These difficulties they're experiencing right now are going how long they're going to last, beyond the year, beyond 2 years. They don't know. And so what are they doing in the meantime? Well, there's a short list. They're looking for more local, local suppliers. They're considering modifying their inputs, replacing them with the alternate inputs and so on, things like that. There's a good chunk of people that are not doing anything right now. I'm not going to quote a specific number, but I was surprised at the number of people that are not actually planning anything, just waiting for things to level out. I think that's a really big risk. And of course, I don't know if it's necessarily a bad risk, but there are new business models that are going to emerge out of this. People are going to start working differently. Maybe if you work with a different supplier, you have a different input in that. It'll come up with a new product. Maybe you market your product differently. Has anybody seen a Corolla, like a Toyota commercial these days? They'll flash a really nice car, and at the end it said, "Order yours today," or you're not going to come into a parking lot with a whole bunch of brand new Toyotas. You have to walk in there and order it. It's on demand, right? So that's a different business model for us. Mm-hmm. It's if I'm looking to get a better deal on the car, that doesn't sound that great. Another experience I've had with this personally is, when the COVID, happened, couldn't get my hair cut. So my wife cuts my hair, and she's been cutting my hair now for the last 2.5 years, despite the fact that I could go and get a haircut. Yeah. Change the business model, it's stuck, But anyhow, people, you hit a bump in the road and you don't know where you're going to end. So, but I think the biggest risk really is those organizations that are not thinking about an alternative scenario. Yeah.
And is there something specific to, for example, semiconductors that you would want to add on to that?
In that case, the problem is amplified because to get into that business is incredibly expensive. And the regional, when I mean regional, I mean there's EU, Canada, US, East Asia, and so on. The niveau de spécialisation is so high that you can't replace all that quickly an input.
Yes, Claude. I want to move on to Johnny. So, Johnny, from your academic point of view of studying what has not worked with supply chain management, what do you see as the main risks and issues moving forward?
So let me start by qualifying what I'm going to say. I'm only been in Canada for the last 3 years. I spent my entire adult career in the US. So some of what I'm going to say may be clouded, biased by what I've seen in Canada versus in the US. Number one risk as well as number one opportunity for all of you who are in the government sector is wrong policies. Okay? Oftentimes when I'm on panel,
this crowd, that might be offensive,
I understand that. I understand that, but since we are going to be provocative, I might as well start, right? I might as well start. Oftentimes I'm asked on the panel, should we shut the borders, do everything, inside Canada? And I said, pipe dream, okay? It's not going to happen as long as you're trading, okay? You can't do that. So the push for reshoring, in theory, in principle, it's good. Why? Reshoring brings jobs back, gives jobs to people, blah, blah, blah. But you don't want to reshore everything. You want to only reshore the kind of jobs that will really, build the next generation economy. So one threat is when the government puts into place policies without really clearly thinking systematically, how does this affect us 10 years from now? Another issue with the government is too many regulations. And the regulations are not only at the federal level, but differences across provinces. Okay? We're seeing that issue right now with medical doctors and not being available in Prince Edward Island. Right? So we gotta think about this from a federal standpoint. From an investment standpoint, there's so many points of entry in Canada in terms of goods. Right? Now, when you compare that to the U.S. actually is probably 2 or 3 times many seaports bring goods into the U.S. and then they go by truck into Canada. So we've got to think about how do we upgrade the seaport infrastructure, and that's something that, fortunately, with what happened in British Columbia and the Port of Vancouver, we saw a lot of stakeholders coming together to quickly, get the port operating again and the rail and the goods moving. So we avoided a worst-case scenario. Now I'm going to get off the government people and talk about the business people, right? We need your help because one of the reasons I'm here and why the federal government is paying most of my salary at Schulich as a Tier 1 Canada Researcher in Supply Chain Management, because in Canada, supply chain management as a profession is 20 years behind the US. Okay? And the reason I say this is because how many of you, when I say supply chain management today, have a picture of trucks or rail bringing goods to you? Well, that's just logistics and transportation. How many of you think of supply chain management? Well, I'm just buying stuff. I'm buying from China, buying from Europe. That's just the second pillar of supply chain management. And most of you probably don't realize that somebody has to make those goods or design those services. Well, when we talk about supply chain management, we now must understand that it's making, delivering, returning, sourcing, and then on top of that, the technology that allows all these processes to be coordinated, and the people who actually need to work in that. So in the earlier session about, what labor market information would be helpful. And I didn't get a chance to ask my question, but the comment I was going to make is that, if we don't look at students who are in the 7th grade and think about how to channel them to the right jobs, well, labor markets are always inefficient. By the time they hit the labor force, ready to take a job, it's too late. That's 10 years too late. So government and business, what are we doing to ensure that you have a supply or pipeline of talent now, because you're going to need them 10 years from now? And if you're not thinking about it now, then 10 years from now, you could see a mismatch between what you need versus what's being provided. So let me stop there. I have more provocative things to say. You can catch me one-on-one, and we get out of argument, but let's give my other panelists a chance. So,
Just very quickly, we'll let Claude chime in.
On your last point.
Take the mic,
The talent. No, just on the talent
you want to
thing.
No.
How does the talent thing compare with the U.S.?
So in the U.S., 20 years ago, the professional societies already started moving so that they understand that supply chain management is really making, delivering, sourcing. And you look at the number of degree programs in the U.S. that actually have supply chain management compared to the U.S., night and day, right? So.
Great, thank you, Johnny. Esther, what are, in your opinion, the main risks and issues moving forward?
Okay, they gave me a lot to respond to. Okay, so we've heard it many different risk factors, and there's a lot of them that perhaps we don't have time to cover today. Just on the workforce, since Johnny brought that up, fully agree that we need to be thinking about sort of labor shortages that exist today, but also what's coming down the pipeline. We hear a lot of talk about shortages in the transportation sector, which have long, that pre-existed the pandemic. It wasn't something that wasn't caused by the pandemic per se. Another piece would be in the construction sector. So both vital segments of the economy that we need to be thinking about as we make our supply chains more resilient. But another piece to that is your regular mom and pop shops, your high contact service types industries and jobs. Something we're constantly hearing at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce from our tourism sector members is that they can't find people to work on the weekends. They can't find people to take a job shift on a long weekend, which happens to be their busiest time. Final sale of goods is also part of the supply chain. So thinking all along the supply chain, you need to be prepping and finding employees for that. Do I think automation is part of the solution? Likely, yes, because the pandemic really did fundamentally change the labor market and what people want from their jobs and the security, and especially in high contact services, they're worried now about getting sick, and perhaps the pay does not compensate them enough for that risk of getting sick. So those are big parts of it. But yes, because we talk about transportation and the construction sector as huge, lots of job vacancies, we often forget that we do also have an issue with that, with just general supply chain operators and management, people who can work in management, understand it, who can apply digital solutions. And I know someone else also mentioned that there are a lot of businesses who are just kind of sitting and not doing anything and waiting to ride this out, to which I respond with, that's a concern, because there is a reason why a lot of businesses don't do anything. And for the most part, it's small businesses, it's medium-sized businesses that just don't have the capital, they don't have the resources to be able to think about better supply chain strategies and operations, or to work with more reliable shippers. They can't be thinking about that because they're still trying to recover from the pandemic and recoup their losses, which they can't recoup because they can't find employees to help them fill those job shifts. So it's a very complex issue, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to make efforts to address each of those. And that includes, teaching kids at a younger age that there are a whole bunch of job opportunities, that there are really good paying jobs in these types of sectors, and promoting those as well. And yes, part of that I think is also providing targeted financial supports for some of the smaller, medium-sized businesses, that they can be thinking about that and having the funds to be able to rethink some of their strategies.
Thank you so much, Esther. One question I want to kind of dig deeper into with Robert to start off with is the question of how does everything we're talking about relate back to energy transition, and we're developing net zero policies. What does this mean when we're looking at it from a supply chain perspective?
Yeah, I think, so I mean, everybody here is familiar with the concept that we're going to go through a major energy transition that's going to result in massive decarbonization and a doubling or tripling of electrification. And that's easy to say, and I think the RBC is estimated that's going to be a $2 trillion spend over the next decade, which is like basically an annual GDP of Canada. So, but at some point you say, where is all that coming from? Like, are we actually going to invent, scale up, prototype, all of that in Canada, or is it coming from overseas? And if you look overseas, where most of that technology is being developed at the moment is in China. As you know, with the IRA in the US, the US is ramping up on a bunch of that stuff. But I have really not heard within the net zero dialogue and the energy transition really any word about supply chains and who our strategic partners are and which pieces we've decided that we are going to build in Canada and have major supply chains going out, because I mean anything we do in Canada is of limited impact if we can't export that to other countries. So I think that's a very good example of an area that is receiving a lot of policy attention at the moment, but in which you rarely hear a supply chain thread in the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone want to react to that one? Yeah, go ahead.
Could I raise it?
Yes, there's a microphone just behind you if you don't mind getting it. Thank you.
This is the most important question for this panel. I think by far. How do we get Canadian companies at the high value end of supply chains that can compete internationally? We get a lot of government propaganda that Canada somehow is, because we spent over $2 billion attracting foreign companies, that we're now an electric vehicle powerhouse, which is absolute nonsense. All the technology is coming from inside Canada, outside of Canada, and I can't see any effort by the Canadian government to see where do Canadian companies fit in the supply chains for the electric vehicle and battery industry. I just don't see it at all. And we read that our industry minister is trying to recruit supply chain companies for electric vehicles. He's doing it in Korea. He's not doing it here. And so this is seems to be the big challenge for Canada, is how do we fit into these supply chains? Because there's no sign that we are going to fit in on batteries or electric vehicles. We talk about being a world resource for critical minerals. We don't have a single production facility in Canada today that is making battery-ready minerals, not one. Nobody talks about the cost of how it's going to be done. Are these going to be companies like Rio Tinto and BHP and Enco, which is owned in Brazil, coming from abroad to do it using their technology? Are we going to have any Canadian companies doing it? This is a huge gap when we look forward on industrial strategy, which is largely being ignored in Canada. We do suffer from a lack of data. We have successful clusters in Canada, and one, of course, is in Sherbrooke on semiconductors, where my familiarity is with DALSA and its early work in developing that very good semiconductor research facility there, which now is American-owned. But they worked with IBM and built something up, and it's very good. We talk about having a semiconductor industry. A number of years ago, we had 3 companies in Canada which were active in semiconductors. Genum in Burlington, which was the world leader in making semiconductors for hearing aids. We had Tundra Semiconductor in Ottawa, and we had DALSA in Waterloo and in Beaumont. All 3 are now foreign-owned. That's another aspect of this question. Are we going to build Canadian companies? How do we participate in this future thing? We rely heavily on the oil and gas industry at present in our balance of payments to help make our trade performance look better otherwise. But 15 years from now, that output may be 30% of what it is today. What's going to replace it? I think the big question is, where do we fit in? What should we be doing? That's what I would like to hear from the panel.
Thank you so much for your question. Who would like to take that? Take that one on.
we had this conversation amongst the four of us, I guess, earlier this week, when we were trying to juxtapose the notion of a supply chain against the value chain. Like, where does the value and who makes the most? Where does the wealth go? Where is the wealth created, and where does it stay? And your point is well taken. We certainly discuss it amongst ourselves. I know I've been discussing that notion with other people in other places in government, and in attracting end users, Canadian end users, creating the next Nortels and creating the next super Canadian companies where these are owned and Canadian operated, and where the wealth remains. Oh, by the way, that point on DELSA, does anybody know DELSA around here? That's such a cool business. They are the world's largest pure play MEMS foundry, and this is not nothing. This, and the little camera that's rolling around on Mars right now, the Mars rover, has a camera that was made in Bromo, which is pretty cool.
First digital X-rays.
There you go. Anybody else want to address that point?
Robert?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's clearly, as a former BNR Nortel person, where we could claim to be a world-leading corporation. I mean, Canada can do this. In the auto parts business, certainly Magna and Linamar are up there as global leaders. We've got a lot of people in the mineral sector that are working overseas and doing leading pieces. For some reason, our mining companies in Canada seem to be foreign-owned, and then the mining companies that are overseas seem to be Canadian-owned. I haven't figured that one out yet. So there is sort of a kaleidoscope of changing leadership areas. But I think the particular point that you raised that I think we certainly the discussions within the academy are concerned about is these emerging areas. So batteries and electric vehicles. What is do we actually have a national industrial policy that is going to lead to us being a leading battery maker? Or are we going to be digging some holes in the ground and shipping the stuff most likely to the U.S.? Right? So I think it really does require a series of policymakers, anything to do with natural resources. And I just came from the Net Zero conference in Calgary, right? And so the Pathways Group, the oil and gas sector, is wrapping its head around what it's going to do for leadership in reducing emissions levels for the oil and gas sector, an area that they are probably already world leaders in, have to figure out how to monetize it. So I think to me, part of the problem is we seem to be a little careful with our policy to our detriment. There needs to be ambition to be global leaders in a series of areas. And you watch Korean policy get played out, you watch Japanese policy get played out. It seems to be more effective. We seem to have a bit more of a laissez-faire approach to doing that. So absolutely share your concern. I don't think it's true that we have no areas in which Canada is a global leader, but they certainly seem to shift around a lot.
Johnny?
So I want to add to Robert's point. First, I want to answer your question. From what I can see as an outsider, I still consider myself an outsider. Green technologies and digitization technology solutions. Digitized technology. I think that's what the government is putting a lot of investment in. Now, can they continue to be tunnel vision and make the right investments and the right put money in the right portfolio? I don't know. Okay, so what we do know from the Japan and Korea and the China example is that when your governments change and new regime comes in and they start taking different priorities, then progress is jeopardized. Excuse me. Right. So the threat to progress is always change. And here, this is where for the policy people, right, the more policies you come up with every 2-3 years, the greater threat is to any national industrial policy, because those take 10 years to come to fruition oftentimes. And that means that the first 4 or 5 years, you really are not expecting anything in return. We don't have that mindset in business. And I'm afraid some governments also do not have that mindset because they want to see impact right away. What's the impact next year? Well, it's not going to happen next year. And if you keep promising that thing's going to happen next year, we're just always going to be chasing the next shiny object.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you want to chime in as well? Yeah, go ahead, Esther.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
This is definitely, there's a whole bunch of talk and a whole bunch of excitement about Canada's opportunity, and especially in Ontario, where a lot of the critical minerals are found, that there's a whole bunch of opportunity that we can become this global leader in creating critical minerals supply chains. But then there's a massive gap between actually implementing or making that a reality. And it's not just the policy side. There's a regulatory component. So even when we talk with our mining sector members, a lot of them talk about how just even the smallest things have to be regulated, and it makes it very, very difficult to actually get things done. And it's not because of an environmental assessment. It's none of that. It's not because they don't want to be engaging with Indigenous communities, for example. They are happy to do that, and they are doing that actively with or without the government. But of course, there's still the piece of regulatory confinements that makes it very difficult for them to move quickly on this. And there's this fear that we have the opportunity to be global leaders, but we're going to miss the window. And this isn't the first time that Canada's done this. It's happened, unfortunately, a few times now. But there's definitely opportunity for us to do it. We need to be thinking, though, like I've mentioned before, about our workforce development strategy. So right now, we don't even have the labor supply to be able to do it. So we need to be thinking about, okay, is immigration the solution? Yes, but in order to get immigration here fast enough, we need to speed up visa processing times. We need to work with industry to figure out which jobs do we need to fill the quickest, prioritize that. And so there's got to be a lot of collaboration. I know someone's mentioned before a systems-wide approach. Very much a systems-wide approach is needed to be able to help create that value chain and to help us get ahead of other countries, if that's still a possibility or reality at this point.
Thank you, Esther. And actually, that was my next question. It was the question of workforce. So I just want to see, before I take the next question, is there anyone else that wants to bounce off the idea of workforce development or maybe immigration as well?
Well, just before we get there, I'd just like to sort of wrap up a little bit here. I want to make sure that a lot of these areas like critical minerals, they aren't bad policies, right? They're probably the right answer. They are a thing we need to do.
It's called the how part.
And who has to worry about that? So part of what we observe in Canada, and this is discussions between, say, the Canadian Academy of Engineering in the UK and the US and others, where engineers tend to be a lot more involved in policy making, is it's not entirely clear to us that the Canadian policymakers have understood quite how difficult a job they have bitten off. It's not that it's a bad decision. It's just that saying the words doesn't accomplish the feat. And we need human resources, masses of capital. Like, where is that capital coming from? Is it all coming from our pension funds? Is it coming from private investors? The UK on its net zero has got a very strict schedule of milestones that it has to meet to get places. And we've never laid one of those out. So for critical minerals, has anybody ever actually sat down and plotted out how much investment you need by next Tuesday in order to get to the next milestone and go forward? Because if you don't plan to that level, it won't happen. And the UK Academy of Engineering has a program with its policymakers in government where they actually brief up and coming policymakers on systems thinking, and then partner them up with senior industry people who they can chat with, every week or so, just to sort of get a feel for, like, you're not in industry, you're not supposed to have to solve this problem, but you do have to understand the extent and difficulty of the actual implementation, not just of the things you're talking about, but the time frame, the very compressed time frame that you're talking about doing them in.
There's a great quote from Andy Grove of Intel. Ideas are easy, execution is difficult.
So I'm going to be looping back to all of you with your recommendations, because I know that's going to be a meaty part of the conversation. I want to leave the place to Olga, please.
Yeah, hi, wonderful conversation. My name is Olga Peña from the Public Health Agency of Canada, and I want to disclose that I am not an expert on supply chains by any means. And my question might be a bit naive, but I was wondering, COVID-19 kind of made us realize that Canada is deficient in certain areas and certain markets. For example, like there were some programs now created for biomanufacturing, enhancing biomanufacturing, because we know that Canada needs to start developing in those areas, right? But my question is how we can leverage international cooperation or multilateralism to hold us while we get stronger to that point. And I know in the health arena, we are trying to do that somehow. Like, I know the World Health Organization, for example, is creating a supply chain of biomedical devices, basically bringing all the nations together to kind of support each other and so on. But I wonder if that's a similar, model that is, imitated in other areas outside health and so on. So.
Thank you for your question, Olga. Who would want to attack that? Robert?
Well, getting right back to the beginning of the question about the energy transition and stuff. That really was exactly the point, that we know roughly how much stuff needs to be done, and it's a lot. We haven't actually decided how much of it we do ourselves and how much we need to partner with strategic partners, reliable partners, in order to do. And it's not just a transitional issue. It's actually, at some point, economics says we will do some of this ourselves, and we will buy the solutions for other parts from other people. So I think along with a schedule, it would be good to see the policy have very specific identification of reliable partners for certain pieces of where we need to get to.
Esther?
Yep, I think that's a great question. I do want to bring up one point about, and especially within the biomedical space, one of the biggest issues happens to be around contracting. So unfortunately, even if we want to think about working with other countries or multinationals to help fill the gap, we end up getting stuck in these contracts for many years that there's no flexibility whatsoever to be able to maneuver around different disruptions or crises that come up. And unfortunately, that's what happened with a lot of companies because of the pandemic. They're still in these contracts. They have no option. They have no way of getting out of them. And the biggest pain point for them has been inflation. And they're still stuck meeting certain requirements at a certain price point, despite the fact that the prices have skyrocketed, and it just doesn't even make sense to be doing business in Canada as a multinational. It doesn't even make sense. But there isn't much to do. There isn't much you can do about that right now because of the way that the contracts are laid out. But that's something we do need to keep in mind going forward, is how do we build contingency planning in contracts? How do we change the language a bit so that we are able to shift quickly and adapt quickly depending on what comes up and what types of crises come up?
Thank you. Johnny, you want to intervene quick? Yep.
So the idea of countries working together as one unit to solve, humanitarian crisis is great. We should all aspire for that. In reality, when push comes to shove, we're all selfish. And we saw what happened, right? So even though the U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner and vice versa, as long as you have some other president, these nationalistic policies of protecting, people inside the country first will come into play. So I think what the World Economic Council and what we're trying to do to make a better world for everybody, it's a good idea. But let's face reality, right? That we still, as a country, as Canada, as U.S., whatever country, you still have to figure out what are the pieces that you need to have inside your borders, and make sure that you build those capacity, reshore those. And to Robert's point, if you look at whatever new technology or what new products are going to occur in the next 5-10 years, and you know which are the critical parts, and you own one of those parts, and you invest in one of those parts, that means that the other parts that are being made by other countries, they can't take advantage of you, right? Because now you all own one important part that together create the final product. If you don't think like that, then we're always going to be behind, right? So.
Great. Thank you so much, Johnny. So I'll take one other question, and then I want to go to the panelists' recommendations.
So I think that this builds on the point that you just made. So I work at Health Canada, and I help to support the biomanufacturing strategy. And we are investing in Canada in biomanufacturing, but I think one of the things that we're also realizing is you can't onshore every single piece of the supply chain. Mm-hmm. So building on the idea that, I'm a government person, that policy isn't going to work. There also during the pandemic, there was essential medicines, just that hospitals, et cetera, needed that it was hard to get, right? There were shortages. There still are shortages, right? There's an acetaminophen shortage right now going on. So the question is, if you can't onshore as a policymaker, what can you try and do? What levers do you think would be most effective to try and ensure that there's resilience and that for essential things that people in Canada need, that they are able to get it?
Esther? And then Johnny. Yeah.
Okay. So a few things come to mind for that question. The first piece really is thinking about, first of all, how to make sure that the people you do have in Canada stay in Canada. And so this kind of ties back to my contract point. But because the costs of operating have basically shot through the roof, and it's very difficult to sort of maintain certain operations that were happening pre-pandemic, a lot of them do want to leave, and a lot of them have started to think about how we're going to leave and find a better place to operate. So that's number one piece, is figuring out how can we work with the existing companies to keep them here as part of the supply chain. The second piece is, I think, for the most part, the idea of competitive advantage when it comes to working with other countries in international trade has changed significantly. In the past, it's always been, okay, who has local economies of scale? Let's think about this. Where can we save costs from an economic standpoint? How can we make this product in the cheapest possible way? But now, competitive advantage can include dealing with risks and what happens if there's a crisis. How do we respond? If we're able to onshore even one part of the supply chain, as my colleagues were talking about, that already puts us in a better place. So instead of bringing the whole operation here, how can we bring one piece of it here, so that we do have competitive advantage in terms of risk management? So that's another piece that I wanted to bring up.
So great question, especially what we saw then during the early days of the pandemic, right? So from a supply chain perspective, there are basically two solutions to make sure that if you can't really make anything in economically right now, what can you do to buffer yourself against, sudden shocks that require those goods? Well, you either stockpile, okay? And if you do stockpile, you must understand you have to learn how to manage that stockpile properly. In the early days of the pandemic, we had PPE. It's just that for some reason, it just expired, right? And so we were managing the stockpile, because if you're taking a course on inventory supply chain, then we were talked about, you don't buy everything in one bulk, you buy in smaller chunks, maybe more expensive, but then you at least know you'll be rotating the expiration of the stockpile. So you need somebody to manage the stockpile, number one. Number two, if you cannot stockpile, then maybe you need to invest in what we call strategic capacity. In other words, the ability to make something even though you don't need to make it right now, right? And if you can't do that, then at least find out who in industry has that ability to be flexible, to switch over, to make that essential good that might be needed suddenly. Now, I'm not talking about toilet paper now, right? But when Canada Goose said, yeah, okay, we can make some of the gowns, we have to retrofit. I mean, that's what the government needs to have, is a list of like, here are the manufacturers that can make essential goods, during these types of crises that we can go to, right? And maybe give them the tax incentives, maybe give them a little break on what they pay taxes on every year. But that's the kind of mindset that the government needs to have in order to actually not have to onshore, reshore everything that's essential. So.
Thank you so much, Johnny. I think, Robert, you wanted to chime in as well?
Yeah, I think there is as Johnny was saying, there's sort of some real world issues. I was over in France just recently, and they were recounting. Actually, it was one of the senior EU directors who was in charge of procurement, and the difficulty that they were having in getting vaccines from the US into the EU, despite the fact that half of the companies that were making the vaccines in the US were French, which they found really infuriating. So and basically this was Biden administration. This wasn't Trump administration. And so they went back home with nothing. And then about a week later, they got a call to say, oh, we've just discovered we're missing this one component out of the recipe. And I said, well, that's just too bad, isn't it? So, and within a couple of weeks, they had a two-way flow. So, some of this is just bare knuckle international politics, and you do need, as you said, you need to have a few aces. The other thing that I did sort of peripherally pick up from the pandemic was, Canada did a lot better than a lot of other countries did in securing vaccines, despite the fact we didn't have our production capacity up. And one of the ways we did it was by actually paying people. Like the word went out that Canada's credit was good. If Canada placed an order, you were going to see the money. And in a lot of other countries, they placed the order and then the money was a long way off. So particularly for things where the government is the customer, having the flexibility within the financial rules to allow you to address an unusual circumstance in a good commercial way seemed to work well. And people just have to game these things. Right? It's not that we didn't know in Canada that we needed capacity to produce vaccines. That whole discussion had been had. It's just we hadn't got around to doing anything about it. So you need to take, and I think maybe this is one of the big lessons that came out of the pandemic, because there will be more, right? And there will be other, whatever you plan for never happens, but the fact that you planned puts you in better shape than if you'd never bothered planning in the first place. So I think from a government perspective, when you go through all the effort of thinking through all of this and all the contingencies and have a plan, you just have to make sure that it actually gets executed. Because we were really close to having done a whole bunch of things right. One of the little TikTok videos that I found really interesting was watching China build COVID hospitals in a week. Like, you don't just whip up a plan and build a COVID hospital in a week. You have a plan that says, one of these days I'm going to need a single purpose hospital built in a week. And put that in place. And I don't think we can do that in Canada.
I think we can do TikTok videos. Not sure if we can do that one, though. So I'm really happy that we have such a strong presence of government people who are in the room. So thank you so much for taking part in this panel. And I want to give the opportunity to go through, give the floor to each of our panelists to say what would be your key recommendation or actions that you want to recommend moving forward when it comes to making the supply chain more resilient. So I'll give the floor to start off to Esther.
I have many, many policy recommendations. I don't know that I can choose just one. I will say that we've been working very... Okay, sounds good. We've been working a lot in this space over the past year and a half, I guess. So we did put out a policy primer not too long ago, I think it was in March, that outlines some of the policy recommendations that I'm about to mention. So I won't have time to go into all of it, but if you did want to check that out, I do recommend that. But there really is no single policy solution that can kind of address everything all at once. It really is just like a systems-wide approach, as we've mentioned previously. And I know that some people think that we should be thinking more about the approach and that we need to be doing just a systems-wide approach, which is very good. Like, we do need to be thinking about that when we do policy recommendations. But at the end of the day, everyone wants to know the specifics. Everyone wants to know, what do I need to do to make myself more resilient, to make the supply chain more resilient? And this is at the government level. This is even at the business level. One of the things that we recommend is, of course, developing a local manufacturing strategy, diversifying procurement and sourcing of components. A big part of that also includes digitization, which I know Johnny has strong opinions on. But when it comes to digitization, the fact that we have to always... So when there's an incident along the supply chain, it takes a while for us to see the ripple effect. But the problem is that without any sort of technology to help get us that visibility, it's hard for us to see it right when it happens. And that's really critical, because if we want to be able to be adaptive and resilient, we need to be able to see when that happens early enough that we can respond. And that's not just at the government level, but that's at the business level. So how do we ensure that digitization happens across the board? Well, first of all, with small businesses, medium-sized businesses. And I'm going to talk a lot about them because they make up the largest part of our economy. So without those supports, those smaller businesses aren't able to contribute to that resiliency of the overall supply chain network. And the second piece I want to bring up is our infrastructure. So at this time, and I know this is especially true for Ontario, we don't really have a centralized location where we can say, this is how many kilometers of roads we have in this specific region, in this specific province. This is where the majority of the routes happen or the transportation happens. What we've seen earlier on in the pandemic, there was a specific bridge that broke down or whatever happened with the bridge, and we had no alternative route. So a lot of that halted the movement of goods, which is awful, because we really should understand sort of where those pain points are, take better stock of our existing infrastructure and figure out where can we make it more resilient, and where can we create alternative routes of or modes of transportation. So those are some of the many pieces that I have. If you want to learn more, I would recommend checking out the policy primer that I mentioned.
Or please come speak to Ask afterwards, because I do see a list there, and it does seem very interesting too. So sorry, but why I want to give the floor to each of them to speak, just so that we can also have a bit of time for questions at the end. So that's why I want to go through all of their recommendations, so that you have a chance also to react and to ask more questions, to dive into what they recommended. So I'll give the floor to Johnny.
I have two specific ones, and I'll be very quick. The first one actually applies to all segments of the society, which is that, in Canada, we have the CSIS, right? The agency that spies on other countries to see what threats they pose. Governments, businesses, we all need some unit whose job is simply to imagine the worst possible scenario possible, so that it can be brought to the attention of decision makers, right? So we need someone to think about, okay, what happens if, we have the next ice stage, right? What are we going to do? Somebody who just sits and thinks about these crazy ideas.
Just sit in an anxiety clinic.
Yeah. I'll start a new business. But that's one piece of advice that I also give.
Do we have Policy Horizons? Is anyone here from Policy Horizons?
Just blame me from the US. I don't know about that. But that's something that's very important for business as well. The other point is really, I believe in regulation, but I also believe in not too many regulations, because all regulations impede flow of goods as well as flow of information. So we need to figure out what regulations are really necessary. And we saw during the pandemic that certain regulations can be relaxed, and society isn't necessarily harmed. So think about which ones are really necessary and which ones can be relaxed.
Thank you, Johnny. Joan.
It's always interesting. One of the key takeaways I'm getting out of this little exercise is how do I say this? Identifying the most critical elements of the supply chain and co-own that or own it outright. Right. I think this is a very significant piece of practical information, and you can use it and act on it. As our colleague here mentioned a little while earlier, we have clusters in Canada. We have an aerospace cluster, we have oil and gas, we have auto sector, we have, agriculture, agri-food, so on and so forth. These are clusters, but we don't actually have an industry policy in place for each of them. Not really. And so in absence of that, we have clusters that morph into something, emerge and grow naturally, organically, and so on. But it doesn't have the discipline that Johnny's just describing. And Robert and Esther, by the way. So I think that's a big takeaway. If there was one thing that I would recommend out of this is, continue funding in ecosystems that would drive that kind of vision, long-term vision for a sector. What do you think?
What's missing from that is, first of all, good research. We have clusters.
Yeah.
Norway, Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
Wine and Niagara Peninsula.
Right.
What we're doing in Sherbrooke.
Yeah.
We don't have any documented studies of how these came about, how they function, to what extent there are Canadian value chains built around them, and how they emerge. We have no information. That's a big problem we have. I know something about Bromont because Silas Chamberlain, who founded Dulce, is a very close friend of mine, and he has taken me through all the steps. It took many years to build that capacity in Sherbrooke. It was paid off very well with really world-class capabilities in Bromont. I think that's Sherbrooke. That's very important.
The Sherbrooke Bromont is a good case study. Actually, and it's actually emerging into something else right now with our colleague here at the University of Sherbrooke, the Institut Quantique. There's the C2MI at Bromont and the IBM plant in Dulce. So you have quantum on one side, semiconductor on the other. And what we're doing right now is working to develop an integrated local supply chain where we actually grow the talent, produce the elements that go into the quantum computers, into the sensors, make them ourselves. Cultivating the talent, not necessarily at the postdoc level, but the technical talent.
One reason
Yeah.
Bromont Sherbrooke facility succeeded was a Quebec civil servant who was determined it was going to happen. And he deserves an enormous amount of credit for bringing everybody together and persevering year after year to make it happen. And that was very, very important in the history of that whole effort.
Oh, but I can't take all the credit for that.
And Quebec is very interesting because it thinks strategically, and I think that's because Quebec thinks like a country more often than the other provinces.
It doesn't have the regional interests. Canada has n number of dollars to invest, and we have the Strategic Innovation Fund, and you want to invest in certain technologies, but guess what? There's a lumber dispute. What happens? What happens to the funds that are made available through SIF? Well,
Quebec had a critical mineral strategy in 2018.
Yeah.
We're still trying to create one.
Maybe I'll let Robert give your recommendations and actions.
Yeah, no,
Get your questions ready for.
I'd love to pick up actually just from where that conversation's going, and I don't know if it's Raymond Bachand who you're thinking of as who was the was he the deputy minister or did he actually become? Yeah, so he was one of the leaders at the time that the Bromont cluster was put together. What I wanted to say from a policy perspective, and my sister used to have this saying of think globally but date locally. I think we are not bold enough in some of these policies, and at the same time we don't pay enough attention to the detail implementation of them, which is something that I've said before. This conversation started in response to a question about semiconductor supply chains, and I've heard it both in this panel and other places that it's hard for Canada to get back into the semiconductor supply chains because it's too expensive. Well, at a 20,000 foot level, the reason we don't get into 12-inch wafers in Canada doesn't have anything to do with the fact it costs $20 billion. It has to do with the fact we don't have the skills and infrastructure to be able to do it, even if we had the $20 billion. But it doesn't stop us from taking $500 million, which is cheap in a global sense, and using that to develop a compound semiconductor industry in Canada. It doesn't stop us from anything that comes in on a 4 or 6 inch wafer is going to be $500 million. Right? The equipment's not nearly as expensive than working at 7 nanometers in 12-inch wafers. So as long as you're dealing with, there's a whole issue. And when the U.S. brought in its CHIPS Act, there was a chunk of money for onshoring existing technology, and then a chunk of money for spurring the next generation. And so when we look at compound semiconductors for the automotive industry, it's early days. If we get in there, we can do it. If we don't get in there, it won't happen. The same thing for quantum computing. We do a lot of quantum programming, but actually building the physical quantum computers requires somebody to put some money down. And I know those discussions are going on around Sherbrooke. But, you just sort of got to get used to $500 million here or there, right? Those are table stakes, and the economic payoffs are many, many times that. But if you're always thinking if you're always thinking cautiously, you're just not going to get there.
Can I just throw in one thing?
Oh, we have.
You need local champions. You need champions to make anything happen. Look at San Diego and biotech sector.
Yep.
They had 2 people. They made it happen. People made what happened in Beaumont happen. You need champions. If you don't have champions, nothing's going to happen.
All did a job for you.
So we have a question here.
Yes, actually, I have 2 questions. The first one is maybe more on a smaller scale. So my name is Chloe Stewart. I work at the CFI, which is a funding agency. We fund infrastructure in Canada. And this year we've seen immense delays in ending projects that have already been funded because, researchers, they can't get the equipment that they need. There's supply chain shortages everywhere throughout all the sectors. So moving forward, do you have any recommendations or things that we should consider when creating awards or revising awards that already exist? And my second question is, I'm not trying to be sassy, but the title did say that is Canada's supply chains become more fragile or more resilient? So I'm just wondering, is there any aspect of our supply chains that are resilient? Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Who wants to answer either the first or second?
What was the first one again?
Sorry, can I make a quick comment? There's nothing wrong with being sassy. And, you have every
sass.
right to ask intelligent questions. Yeah, so the first question is, looking at, as a funding agency, what are things that we should be considering when creating or revising awards that already exist? Awards that we're going to be giving to researchers. Moving forward, how can they deal with the supply chain issues? What should we be putting in, like any contingencies we should be putting into our awards to make sure that, years or months down the line, they don't have to send us something saying we need more time, because things just aren't coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much for the questions. Johnny?
So from an academic perspective, and then we have some other colleagues in the audience as well. So be a little more flexible. Don't expect an outcome that is tangible, because to Robert and my colleagues' point, sometimes you actually have to invest in something that you don't even know what's going to happen in terms of a product that could be built from it. It's basic research. How much money is actually going into basic research as opposed to innovation of a product that will lead to a product? That's something I'm seeing a lot in Canadian research funding, which is that oftentimes successful grantees promise something that's a little more concrete and tangible than I see elsewhere, where basically it's like, this could be a breakthrough, but it's going to take this much time, this much money, and it's 50-50 chance. Will you fund this? That would be one thing I would say. Maybe think about creating pockets money that's like.
What I would say in terms of the first question, and so one of my many hats in the past was I ran Nortel's university research program. So we had 350 projects running simultaneously globally, and we supplied equipment to a lot of them with CFI help. So, but back in those days, there was an obvious stream of equipment that actually had a production schedule. And the trouble with a lot of university or college research equipment is it's not high volume stuff. Right? So you have to cut a little slack because COVID really did whack a lot of that stuff off balance. But I'll say when you're dealing with Europe and the Horizon projects and these big European things, they actually have fully funded program managers who work along with these projects. They bring them together. They facilitate university industry interaction, and they start 2 years before the application comes in. So somebody's gone and visited those plants and made darn sure that they're actually, that there's actually a chance that equipment is legit and is going to be there on time. So, and I don't know if there's a different, boots on the ground, right? Sure, we shipped a few empty boxes to make accounting happy at year end, but by and large, stuff went through. So I think oversight is important, and it's hard for individual professors to expedite, global instrumentation suppliers, but it certainly would improve your hit rate if you had people whose role that was.
So I want to let Esther answer that question. Sorry.
No, I was just going to ask you, what's your experience right now with that issue?
In terms of how many people are out, so I would say of the amendments to awards that I get every week, probably more than half are asking for extensions, and often the reason is because of supply chain stuff. Unilaterally, we've just been granting them with things like COVID supply chains are an issue. We don't ask for more information because everybody knows supply chains are weak right now. But we're just wondering how we should be moving forward.
Well, you sound like you just answered that question. If you have the experience rating, build that into, factor that in.
So I want to let Esther answer the question and also then finish off with the last question of what is resilient within our advanced tech supply chains. Esther?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up that question because I think it comes back to thinking about practical solutions for how we can, I think for the most part since the supply chain delays and disruption started, most people knew they were happening, but they didn't understand why. And to this day, actually, a lot of companies still don't understand what exactly needs to be changed. So sometimes in my conversations, they'll say, oh, we want government to step in and help us address this issue. And I ask, okay, well, what do you want them to do? And they don't know. They don't actually have an answer. So I think it's an important issue that you raised. In terms of going forward with how you approach some of these, and I don't know how the contracts are formulated right now, but I would say awarding contracts or projects to companies that can prove they have a very resilient or risk-considerate strategic plan. So they have this one supplier, but that if this doesn't work out, they have an alternative supplier. There wasn't much we could do because we didn't know that the bottlenecks would happen the way that they did. But now that we do know that, it's what are we going to do with that information, right? So thinking about how do we plan and making sure that the company itself has that plan in place and is willing to consider things like digitization and other tech solutions, right? So to be able to give that transparency and visibility for where their products are at and be able to show that they can do that I think would be an important step in that process.
Thank you, Esther. So just to finish off, I want that to be our last question. What is resilient within our supply chains? Who wants to tackle that one? Robert?
Yeah, well, I'll certainly start. And I think I said this at the beginning. We have a lot of businesses that are functioning well and who have reacted well over the last couple of years to shortages. And I think you'll find a lot of them, as Johnny was saying, have staff whose business it is to manage supply chains and have been out pushing and scraping. I mean, without naming any companies, but there are a bunch of account receivable people out there that you really don't want to meet in the dark, right? It's I think there are. So I, as far as I know, the aerospace manufacturing sector, last time I sort of had up-to-date information, was running well. I think there are significant areas of computers and sensors and others that are running well, but I think for everyone that's running well, there's some others that are having to work on their internal processes. And what happens is, if we have a lot of small companies, and particularly in the high-tech area, they're often on an up ramp. Did their angel investors and others decide to spend their dollars on supply chain management, or did they decide to spend it on something else? And I think there's a lot of people out there at the moment reevaluating their choices. But small companies are great at adapting, and so I think the economy hasn't come to a complete stop. There's a lot of people whose supply chains are working, but I think any opportunity for the government to highlight the need and to talk about supply chains will trigger discussions at boards of directors that will cause people to actually start paying attention to this, or more attention to this stuff.
I'll give the closing words to Esther.
Oh, lots of pressure. I think it's very hard to pinpoint something very specific within Canada that is resilient. But I will say that there have been a lot of companies that have figured it out, and they were able to sort of survive even with all the supply chain disruptions. And they might not be Canadian owned, such as IKEA, but they were able to. They had the money, they had the resources, they had the capacity to be able to charter their own ship, for example, to buy their own shipping containers, and that helped them a lot with moving goods. So unfortunately, those are just the big companies that didn't include the smaller ones. But at the very least, I think with the pandemic, it showed that we are very resilient as an economy. We've been pushed a lot, and we're still alive. We're still moving. And we also saw a lot more collaboration happen between the private and the public sector. And I think that's very important going forward, because this gives us the opportunity to learn from the companies that did have the money and the resources and the capacity to be able to become more resilient and adjust really quickly. So we can take those lessons from those companies, and also the public sector and the government can also learn from that as well.
Thank you so much, Esther. So now I'm fully aware that I'm the last thing separating you from the cocktail hour. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who shared their time with us in this panel. If you can join me in thanking our panelists, Robert, Claude, Johnny, and Esther.